Sir, drug or alcohol use, I mean, in this context is being required that the officer consider to determine if de-escalation is appropriate. It can be true that some people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol can become dangerous, correct?
That is correct.
But isn't it also true that some people react completely different and they are not necessarily dangerous if they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs?
That is correct.
In fact, they may not be more dangerous, they may actually be more vulnerable.
True.
And it's important that the officer considers that when determining whether to go the route of force or continued force or de-escalation. Fair?
Yes.
Behavioral crisis is the last bullet I'd like you to discuss. What do you mean by behavioral crisis?
Behavioral crisis, of all the bullets, sometimes that is probably the one that our men and women experience in our communities most. If someone loses a job, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. If someone loses a loved one, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. If someone has themselves got the worst diagnosis from their doctor that day, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. And so we want our folks to take all of those things into consideration. When I talk about meeting our community where they are, that's probably the one that we need to really focus on. Yeah.
And as you testified, very best day, do they?
No, they don't.
And the behavioral crisis, as the kind you've described here, can in fact be a barrier to compliance. Would cause an inability to comply, even if not, an intentional inability to comply. That's fair.
Let's go to list,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so the purpose of the listing a behavioral crisis as a point of consideration for a law enforcement officer is what?
Again, it's recognizing that when we get the call from our communities, it may not often be their best day, and they may be experiencing something that is very traumatic. But we're going to respond, but we have to take that into consideration because, as I mentioned again, we may be the first and last time they have an interaction with a Minneapolis police officer, and so we have to make it count. It matters.
Would this be a good time to stop before I go into the next line? I'm sorry, I was trying to push it to the time limit. So.
All right, members of the jury will take our lunch break, come back at 1:30. Chief, you may step down.